Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators, a production of KRWG Broadcasting. Your Legislators is a public service program providing our viewing audience in southern New Mexico the opportunity to hear about important legislative issues directly from their elected representatives in Santa Fe. Here's your host, Sloan Patton.
Welcome to another edition of Your Legislators. I'm Sloan Patton. We're honored to have with us today Dr. Garrey Carruthers. He was the governor of New Mexico from 1987 to 1991, and he's now the dean of the College of Business here at NMSU. Dr. Carruthers, thanks for being with us today.
You bet. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would like to talk about is Governor Martinez a little bit. I know maybe it's strange to talk about other governors, but for her, she just did her State of the State address, and she addressed several issues, but she decided to take on the driver license law. Politically, why do you think that she chose that issue?
Well, I don't know why she chose the issue, but I will tell you from having known her for a long period of time, she's very highly principled. And this is a principle with her that I think that illegal people should not have legal documents, including driver's licenses. I think we're only one of two states that even allow this anymore. And for some reason, she's kind of latched onto that as a crusade. And part of it comes from her principles. She's a former district attorney. Legal things are legal things to her. And so she's going to continue to pursue it. I understand that now may be a move underway to kind of modify her legislation to be more suitable to some of the legislators, and we'll still have an opportunity for immigrants to have driver's licenses. Haven't seen the language on that, but at least there seems to be a movement in trying to change the law we have right now.
When you're governor, do you get to pick several issues that you feel passionate about, or is there one or two things that you know that you'll have to pick those when you go into office and you're just going to have to keep going at them?
We always have to do the budget. I mean, that's right off the top. Everybody has to do a budget. I happen to live as governor in a time when the economy was good and we were moving up, so I didn't have the challenges of trying to scrape together a few bucks to even fund the state, so that was not a challenge. But there is a saying that the governor proposes, the legislature disposes. So basically, and you see the same thing at the national level. President Obama just gave his message the other day, and so he proposes. These are the things that he believes we need to do as a country, and then sends them over to the Congress, and they dispose. Now the Congress can come up with their own ideas, and the legislature comes up with their own ideas. But the principal responsibility, in my view, of the governor is to sense those opportunities, to make some concrete proposals on how to take advantage of opportunities, and then to pursue them with the legislature. And that's what I enjoyed about being governor is you did get to recommend things. You didn't just respond to what the legislature was doing.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that one issue that you were passionate about when you were in office was the death penalty. Why did you push to have it reinstated?
Well, I didn't push to have it reinstated. It was in until after I was elected governor of Anaya, commuted the death sentences of about 5 or 6 or 7 people, and as a consequence they went back to prison as life termers. But the death penalty was never removed. It was still part of the statute while I was governor. The entire time I was there. In fact, a couple of men were actually sentenced to death during the time that I was governor. Mm-hmm. The death penalty was removed from the statutes in the last 4 or 5 years. It's been in the last 4 or 5 years under Governor Richardson that we removed the death penalty as a cause here in New Mexico. So I couldn't do anything about the commutations that Governor and I made because that was his authority at his time. Right. But I did not do the same for the couple of people who were convicted during my time who were sentenced to death. It takes so long to move through that process, however. No one was punished that way during my term. at all. The people who would have been punished with capital punishment were all commuted by Governor Anaya.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the political landscape's changed the most from when you were governor to now?
I think it's much more adversarial than when I was governor. I had a good relationship with the legislature. I'm a Republican, a minority party in New Mexico. Both the House and Senate were principally Democrat. The Senate, actually the day I was elected, was 21-21 Republican and Democrat. So I had a split there. The House was still Democrat with a powerful speaker. But I found in working with the legislature, I enjoyed working with them and kind of collaborating on issues like the workers' comp system was in bad shape. We kind of collectively got together and fixed that to the point it was considered a model law, and still is all these years later. So I enjoyed doing it. You don't see that kind of camaraderie, you don't see the kind of cohesiveness that we had back in the old days, focusing on New Mexico issues. We see more posturing about this is a Democrat way of life, this is a Republican way of life, and we're going to posture ourselves to death.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it seems like today issues that didn't used to be partisan have become partisan issues, and maybe one of those could be, the economy is certainly one that that both parties should be able to agree on, but it's caused a lot of differences. What do you think New Mexico's economy needs?
Well, I think they need a better educated workforce, to be honest with you. I think we ought to focus our attention much more on technical career education. The two-year colleges are primarily in charge of that. Four-year colleges have a role to play. But if there's one thing we need to do is to upgrade our workforce so it's internationally competitive, and that would be the most important thing we can do. Now, economic development and business development, oftentimes both Democrats and Republicans can agree upon it. Where you get into trouble is on some strategies. Republicans believe if you cut taxes, then that's going to stimulate the economy. Democrats generally say, no, what we want to do is add incentives to business to do these kinds of things, give away tax money to do these kinds of, maybe give grants to do these kind of things. And so there's always a difference of opinion, mostly around taxation and the value of taxation. I see Governor Martinez has asked that we reduce the corporate tax rate this time to make us more competitive with the surrounding states. That's oftentimes what you hear a lot about around Santa Fe is, are we competitive with the surrounding states? You'll have another issue that may or may not surface. It surfaces from time to time, called right to work. And as you know, I think it was in Wisconsin, the governor and the legislature essentially went to a right to work state, created a big problem with the unions. That's always a red flag issue anytime, because it's always the Republicans who propose it, the Democrats who oppose it. And it's been reintroduced here. It was introduced in my time, actually passed one time, believe it or not, and the governor vetoed it. But that's an issue that I guarantee you, anytime you put it on the legislative agenda, you'll have an adversarial relationship between the Republicans and the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And by the way, right to work is considered by Republicans, or many Republicans, as central to our moving forward as an economy.
Right.
I don't think it's quite as central as they think it is, simply because we're not a highly unionized state.
Right. And I know that you have worked, of course, a lot with economic development. And besides the population in the north, I'm sure that has a big factor. Why does the South not have as much job growth as the North in New Mexico?
Well, Albuquerque obviously is the major city, and you're going to see more job growth in the larger city just by the numbers, by the size. Right. But we have been, actually, it's not exactly true, it depends upon how you define the South. An area right now that you can't even find anybody that wants to go to work is over in the southeastern part of the state, around Hobbs and Artesia and Carlsbad and Roswell. They just can't find people to go to work over there because the mining industry's come back. They have a new refining plant for uranium rods for power plants. They have oil and gas development is continuing on at a robust pace. And as a consequence, they're 24-hour restaurants who typically, by brand, are 24 hours, only open for 12 hours because they can't find enough people to staff at the other 12 hours. So job growth over there is fine. Down here, it's a little soft. I don't know, I think our unemployment rate's running about 6.2, 6.3% statewide right now. I'm going to guess it's a little higher here than it is, say, in Albuquerque or Rio Rancho. It'll be really high in the northern Rio Grande area. It's always higher there. And it'll be tremendously high, say, on the Navajo Reservation. But there are pockets like Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, that have relatively low unemployment rates.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the Navajo Reservation, I understand that you've done some research on the differences between Native American business practices and sort of a cultural difference there.
Right.
How does the Native American business perspective compare to some others that we would see in the state?
Well, it was amazing to me. It was done by some faculty members here with a faculty member from the University of Utah. And I've lived in New Mexico all my life. I actually grew up near the Navajo Reservation. Never observed what we finally found out in these studies. But for example, in terms of trade and commerce, the ethics in the general population are somewhat different than you find among most Native Americans. For example, it's the Native American ethic in business and commerce is all about trust. And Native Americans trading with each other trust each other. So it's not uncommon in their country for the seller to kind of downgrade the product. This horse isn't as good a horse as you think it is. It doesn't run as fast as maybe you might think it would. And the buyer says, no, that looks like a really good horse. I've seen that horse run before. And so it's not uncommon for the seller to downplay the product and the buyer to be more eager. In the major economy, in our economy, we always start with high prices, and the buyer has to bring the price down and argue the price back down. The other thing about Native Americans is they're not into accumulation of wealth, which causes them to behave differently in a free economy than we would. They're more into, if they happen to be fortunate to have some wealth, they're more into distributing it to the rest of the village. They're not into possession. We're into possession. But if they possess something that the village needs, the village gets to use it. And as a consequence, they have many redeeming features that some of the rest of us ought to adopt in our business practices. Trust, not always worried about accumulation of wealth, possession, those kinds of things. Sharing. Native Americans are much greater about sharing their resources.
Yeah. As a governor of a state like New Mexico, what is it like to govern over the reservations that are in the state? Were there certain things that you weren't able to do when you were in office that you ever wanted to, or limits there?
Well, I think one of the few limitations has to do with police power. Many Native American nations, crimes of a certain level are either handled by the nation or by the FBI. And because we have a nation-to-nation relationship between our 22 nations and the federal government, in police power, oftentimes they go more directly to federal intervention, say through the FBI, than you would otherwise. But they're all citizens. For example, if they need capital outlay, they need schools, they need libraries, all of those kinds of things, that's a responsibility of the state. And so it makes it a little trickier because the federal government has similar responsibilities to these Native Americans. They've not always done as well keeping their responsibilities, so the Native Americans will turn to the state as citizens, as they should, and ask for roads or ask for libraries or ask for school funding and that sort of thing. So it's a split responsibility of which, in my view, sometimes the federal government doesn't uphold its end always as well as it should.
Sure. Well, do you think it's a little bit easier for Native Americans in states like New Mexico or Arizona than it is where they aren't as populous, they aren't able to maybe go and get those state resources?
Well, we do have an advantage. About 9 to 10% of our population is Native American. We have 22 nations. We have a really large nation in the Navajo, which we share with Arizona and Utah. But they have considerably, in my view, more political power here than they would, say, maybe in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, or some of the other states. Now, when you get up to Alaska, where there are lots of Native Americans, that's not always the case because they have high percentage of their population is Native American up there as well. So what happens here, if you look at our legislature, there are a number of legislators who are Native Americans, and some of them have been there for a long, long time and acquired some tenure and as a consequence they have committee chairmanships, or they have enough stroke with the rest of their colleagues to get their propositions passed on behalf of Native Americans.
I'd like to talk a little bit about health care in the state. You were the president and CEO of the Cimarron Health Plan.
Correct, yeah.
For about 10 years. What do you think New Mexico needs to change health-wise? What have you seen in the state that you'd like to see change?
Well, I should say, to Governor Martinez's credit, she did decide under Obamacare to expand Medicaid.
Right.
And that will bring about 170,000 more people, mostly adults, into a healthcare system in insurance. And I should to recognize now a bias, I'm on the board of directors of Molina Healthcare, which is a Medicaid provider in New Mexico. They're the company that bought the company I used to work with a long time ago. So you need to understand I come from a business perspective.
Sure.
But I give Governor Martinez credit for expanding it because we do have a lot of people who are uncovered. Now, having said that, if you ask me what would I do to improve the health status of New Mexicans, it would have a lot to do with education. We need to solve a number of problems. Obesity comes to mind. We have a high incidence of diabetes in many of our populations. A lot of that is driven by diet. We need also to provide certain kinds of care in the rural areas that we cannot do right now. When I was in the industry, for example, there was very few psychiatrists in the rural areas, if any at all. Right. So if you needed psychiatric care, you ended up having to go to Las Cruces or Albuquerque or maybe Santa Fe. There were just a limited number of those. There were very few OBGYN physicians in rural areas to take care of women and do the prenatal care and that sort of thing. So there are shortages of certain kind of care. How would I solve it? I think New Mexico is one of those states that needs to look more and more toward what we call mid-level providers, certified nurse practitioners, for example, or physician's assistants. Many of the healthcare needs of our New Mexicans could be addressed by just having proper care and maybe an evaluation or what we call a physical every year. Just come in and see a certified nurse practitioner. Check your teeth, check your hearing, check your blood pressure, check your weight, check these kind of things. But they don't have access to that right now. As a consequence, they don't get that care. Most of the things that happen to all of us, even at my age, can be taken care of by mid-level up to a point. And then you need to turn to the physician community and specialists and that sort of thing. I think we're going to need more of those people, better education, particularly on diet in New Mexico. We also have a high incidence of accidents and violence, which is a healthcare issue. And of course, that one we are always attempting to work on. This governor and other governors have spent a lot of time on DWI, for example. And I think Governor Martinez now wants to even increase the penalty for DWI. That's a health issue in our state that we continue to work on.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, so with back when you were governor, you were the I believe there were 4 Democrats before you that were governor,
right.
and you were the first Republican in that sort of string of Democrats. Was that tough to make that transition?
Well, it was kind of interesting. There was an 18-year period. By the way, we used to have 2-year governors, and then we went to 4-year governors. That's why I think it was 18 years. Yeah. But it was 18 years since a Republican had been elected to the governorship. Now, the other thing that made it a little difficult for me is I really had never operated in Santa Fe. I'd never been a member of the legislature, for example. Now, I had spent time in Washington, D.C. working with the Congress as Assistant Secretary of the Interior. So I had government experience, but it was federal government experience and working with the Congress. So that was a good experience for me, but I did not have that kind of relationship with our own legislature. So, you know, I fortuitously was elected one day, and all of a sudden I said, wow, now I've got to go to work. Well, you have some challenges. You're a new guy in town. In fact, the speaker then, Raymond Sanchez, is fond of saying he was a pretty good governor after I got him trained. and so he really believed that way. But I went to Santa Fe, I believe, with some preconceived ideas about how important it was to be a governor, how I could recommend these policy changes I mentioned to you. I was by the way, very pro-education. I spent most of my time dealing on educational issues. And I just thought they would readily accept that and say, this Carruthers is the smartest guy we've ever met, and we ought to do what he wants to do. Didn't work that way. So what I had to do is develop a relationship with the legislature to the point that I had, for example, during the legislative session, one of our conditions in the office is if any legislator wanted to visit with me, they would cut in front of the line in front of people who had appointments. Now, they didn't take terrible advantage of that, but they felt that they could come in to see me, maybe spend 5 minutes and go away satisfied. The other thing I did is I met with both Republicans and Democrats in the evening, had a cold one with them, talked about how things were going, negotiated a little bit, that kind of thing. And I think that's what's missing right now is that attempt to be collegial and to get acquainted with each other and understand each other's differences, but be respectful but differ. And I think we're missing a little bit of that right now.
Is it just a cultural change? Why do you think it's changed over the years?
Well, I think all of politics has become harsher. When I ran for governor, I ran against a man named Ray Powell, who's a fine man. And in that entire campaign, there was no negative ads, believe it or not. Ray was older than I, so I took advantage of him because he had no grandchildren, and I had these 2 little grandchildren. And so here I was at age 46 or 47, running around holding up little grandchildren, talking about the future of New Mexico. Ray didn't have any grandchildren to hold up, so I always took advantage of it because of that. But the advertisements back in those days were promoting what you were going to do for the state, not tearing the other guy down. I mean, I was out there advocating for better education, more jobs, efficient government, that kind of thing, and he was promoting his case, and that's what campaigns were all about. So you didn't go into town once you were elected with all of these enemies who say you said bad things about my friend Ray Powell, and therefore I'm not going to like you. We went to town knowing that, well, Carruthers promotes these things, he got elected, so that's what we're going to hear about. And we didn't have that adversarial, that high tension, almost nasty attitude about each other that you see developing nowadays. I don't know when it changed either, but I'm going to allege you guys on TV did it.
It's our fault, I know. Well, I'll blame CNN for it.
CNN,
MSNBC, I don't know, Fox. Well, so with this region of the country, a lot of people that aren't from here might assume, how do we get any water out here? I mean, we're in the desert. How do we have enough? It seems like we have to be running out.
We, this very day, should be praying for snow in Colorado, because most of our water coming down the Rio Grande comes out of the mountains in Santa Fe north into Colorado. Mm-hmm. And they have not had great snowfall over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I just saw a piece on Elephant Butte and how low it is right now, and it's getting not as low as I've seen it, by the way, but it's getting very low. So we go through these cycles, but we are highly dependent upon snowfall and to some degree rainfall in the northern part of our state, the southern part of Colorado. So what we have to do, obviously, is be more conservative when we're in these drought periods. But this has always sort of been this way. Until we regulated this river, there are like 4 dams on this river. I think there are 4 dams on this river. So it became a regulated river, and so we could store water during the good times, release it during the irrigation season. And so that's kind of saved our bacon over time. And when you release water down the river, it also, in the valley areas, recharges the groundwater as well. When you irrigate, it recharges groundwater as well. So we are highly dependent upon river flow, mostly snow, to some degree rain coming down the river. And we just haven't had 4 or 5 good years here. It's been pretty dry. But, you know, we've gone through it. We'll go through it again. Another advantage of our state, given our water laws, is if the city of Las Cruces runs out of water, they can go out and buy a farm and buy their water rights and use those for the city use. Under our laws, it's got to be for beneficial use. So we have made provision, if somebody runs out of water, if you're willing to pay the price, you can buy water rights, generally from agriculture. I don't remember the number, but a very high percentage of water in New Mexico is dedicated to agriculture, as you would guess. It's a high consumptive use of water. And so if anyone's looking for water, they typically look to get it from agriculture, but they have to buy it.
Right, sure. And if that meant raising taxes for citizens, is that something you think that a governor or even local representative could sort of get away with politically?
Well, I'm probably the only Republican you'll ever know that asked for a tax increase. That's probably why I'm not in politics anymore, because Republicans are not supposed to do that. But I asked for a 1/4 cent gross receipts tax raise, which is still on the books, to pay teachers more. And the legislature, the Democrat side of the legislature, was eager to pass it. The Republicans were not. Republicans, as a rule, do not like to raise taxes. But I felt our teachers were not paid enough. And as a consequence, I asked for a 1/4% gross receipts to pay teachers more money. And for that, I got some conditions to include grading schools, which we now do under Governor Martinez, but after I left, they took that provision away. But for paying teachers more, I did ask for some accountability measures. So when you say taxation, when you talk to a Republican, taxation is one thing Republicans don't do very easily. But if they do, they pretty much expect a high level of accountability, whether it's to buy water rights. By the way, we're going to get into, going back to the water issue, we're always in trouble with Texas because we don't have enough flow going through either the Pecos River or the Rio Grande River. So you can hear the rumblings down in Texas like we're not getting enough water. We think New Mexico's mining water on us. And so we're kind of feeling, if this drought keeps going, that we're going to hear from Texas via the courts with a lawsuit on water. Then we ended up, during my time, having to spend several $1 million in dollars that we gave to Texas to pay them off because we'd used too much water.
Well, Dean Carruthers, thanks for being with us today. You're welcome back anytime. And thank you for joining us for another Your Legislators. We'll see you next week.